After 15 years of stagnating incomes, a new report suggests that after housing costs, real disposable incomes are likely to continue falling for the next 5 years. The decline will be felt by all income groups, but especially those on benefits, poorer households and single parents. They'll see the biggest drop. The only group who will do marginally better are pensioner couples. The biggest reason for this forecast decline in living standards are a continued period of stagnating economic growth combined with higher taxes, higher housing costs and lower benefits. It means that the average household could be over £1,400 worse off in 2030 compared to 2019. To put this into context, in the post-war period, we saw several decades of rising living standards, but since 2008, that growth has been broken, meaning that households are around, say, £10,000 less than if a pre-trend crisis had been maintained. But an actual drop in living standards from this point would be a real problem for both households and general government finances. The OBR forecasts from last October 2024 were slightly more optimistic, with very modest increases in disposable income forecast. But since October, forecasts for the economy have worsened, with both higher interest rates and lower growth and higher rents. The OECD have recently downgraded forecasts for the UK economy. They've also downgraded forecasts for many other countries too. But worryingly for the UK, we're seeing bond yields rise to their highest level since the financial crisis, and the UK now has one of the highest borrowing costs amongst advanced economies. And this is creating a really unfortunate dynamic, meaning that high debt levels require even more debt interest payments. Debt interest payments over £100 billion a year, and they're the third largest component of UK government spending. It's a real headache. In 2024, the new Labour government inherited one of the worst combinations of high debt, high interest rates and low growth. But if anything, growth has deteriorated in the past 9 months or so, and this has led to higher borrowing costs, and therefore higher than expected borrowing has exceeded the Chancellor's forecast from last October. And it means that the Chancellor's already very small fiscal headroom has been eroded, given another painful choice between more taxes, spending cuts, or even more borrowing. And in trying to meet these self-imposed fiscal targets, ironically the economy has been weakened. Firstly, the planned rise in national insurance contributions has led to lower levels of hiring. The Resolution Foundation suggests that the decline in employment rates is starting to resemble past recessions, and this is a big concern. Secondly, benefit cuts will hit the spending power of households when consumer confidence is already very low. And for the government, there's a reluctance to borrow more because, although you could do it as a temporary stopgap, firstly, borrowing is much more expensive, but secondly, long-term debt forecasts are pretty grim. An ageing population will cause more spending on welfare, more spending on pensions, more spending on healthcare, and so debt is forecast to rise in the coming years, and that's even before things like more defence spending and a backlog of problems from the last decade of austerity. National Audit Office highlighting a £49 billion backlog in maintenance repairs alone. One reason for the downgrade in UK growth forecasts is the deterioration in global economic growth. The new reality of tariff wars and general uncertainty has seen the price of gold soar in value, but on the back of very high, unprecedented levels of global uncertainty, the highest for many decades. Now, whilst many countries do face a challenging economic situation as well as the UK's growth has been relatively poor compared to other advanced economies in recent years. The UK economy is struggling particularly in the industrial sector. Recent data suggests some improvements actually in the service sector, but big falls in industrial production. One big problem for the UK economy is the relatively high price of electricity, higher than many other European countries, and this is hurting energy-intensive industries like, say, the chemical industry. In fact, the UK economy is almost a story of two different tales. The service sector not doing too badly, industry decreasing quite worryingly. High energy prices, of course, also really hurt households, with energy prices rising faster than inflation in recent years, and this has been a significant drag on living standards. Another weak part of the UK economy is the housing market. High house prices, interest rates on mortgages going up, and also rapidly rising rents. Especially for those living in the private rented sector, housing is taking a bigger share of income, snuffing out any gains in rising wages. Although high housing costs are a problem across the advanced world, it is not unsolvable. Cities in the US with looser planning rules have seen big increase in supply and falling rents. Japan is an interesting case study for the UK. 3 decades of stagnant economic growth in Japan, something the UK could be soon emulating. But Japan's very poor economic growth has been helped at least by the fact that Japanese housing is more cheap. London rents over $2,000 a month. In Tokyo, they're around $1,300. Japan has very different planning rules, meaning that you can build houses in high demand areas. And this goes a long way to making living costs affordable. Another contrast with Japan is that the UK has seen much higher demand from a growing population, high levels of migration in recent years, pushing up demand but without an equivalent increase in supply. Another reason for low growth is very low levels of investment, both public and private. UK investment, of course, been low for a variety of reasons. Planning restrictions have held back investment in housing and manufacturing. The Brexit shock of uncertainty and new, more expensive trading relations has hit business confidence. According to NESR, the cost of Brexit has so far reduced GDP by around 2 to 3% than what it otherwise would have been, but this could escalate to 5 to 6% of GDP by 2035. The OBR predict a smaller GDP decline, but at least some of the future low-income growth is impacted by the effect of Brexit. And this is a big change in trading relations, and we get a better trading deal. Apart from low investment, what else causes low productivity? Well, government spending as a share of GDP is rising, but the public sector has really seen very stagnant productivity growth. This graph shows a stark contrast between the two sectors. Despite digitisation, public sector productivity has been disappointingly absent. Also, it can be harder to increase productivity in a service sector-based economy, which the UK is increasingly becoming. Where labour takes a bigger share of inputs, it can be harder to increase productivity. And it's not just the UK. It's fair to say global productivity has slowed down since 2009. Firms are still taking time to work out how to introduce AI and make it benefit their business. And if you're looking for a more optimistic take on the economy, what about this? Some argue GDP is underestimating actual living standards. The argument is that these days we spend 8 hours a day looking at a screen, but all of this consumption is relatively free. Back in the day, a CD cost £15. Today you can just listen to music more or less for free. So according to statistics, that will show up as a lower GDP, but we're still consuming the same amount of music. So in theory, GDP may be better than what it actually suggests. But, and it's a big but, there is another counterpoint to this argument. Actually, we're not living in a technological nirvana, but living standards are actually worsened by all the technology and smartphones. Addiction to smartphones is causing us to be depressed, distracted, and less productive. Maybe it's no coincidence that the productivity slump occurred just after the arrival of the smartphone. Anyway, that's really an interesting question for another day. Maybe make a video about that later. But back to the main topic is that why is UK got such low growth prospects? Another big factor worth mentioning is rising rates of inactivity. People not working either due to sickness, early retirement, or a whole host of other reasons. And it is getting worse in the UK, especially amongst young people. Rising sickness is a big problem for the UK economy. In 2002, the UK had one of the lowest rates of inactivity in Europe. Now it's one of the highest. And of course, inactivity costs both the government sickness benefits, less tax revenue, also the individuals themselves who are not working, getting less income, and of course, economic growth as well, firms struggling to hire sufficient workers. Also, when looking at future living standards, it's not just about income, but also the state of public services. Stagnating incomes can in theory be offset by rising quality of healthcare, education and transport. But unfortunately there seems to be no easy solution to the the current state of public services. Despite higher spending, NHS waiting lists rose to record levels recently. Now, there are very tentative signs of a very slow decline in waiting lists, but it's from a very high base, and it will be difficult to get it down to levels last seen in the early 2000s. So that's all a pretty grim picture, but could these dire predictions actually prove to be inaccurate? Well, economic forecasts certainly have a long history of being wrong. Unfortunately, the recent decade, we've often seen economic forecasts be overly optimistic and the outcomes generally worse than forecast. The most worrying is perhaps the frequency with which the OBR has predicted an uptick in productivity, an uptick in economic growth, only to be disappointed a few years later. And if productivity continues a trend of the past 5 years, then incomes may fall by even more than the OBR predict. Nevertheless, there is still a way to paint a slightly more optimistic picture. It's not quite the end of the world, because for all the talk of falling household incomes, at least at the moment, wage growth is running at 6% a year. That's nominal wage growth. And this is largely due to government increasing public sector pay after many years of falling behind. Now, of course, this kind of pay growth is unlikely to last, but it is a reminder that although we've got higher taxes, are depressing demand and job creation, these are offset by higher government spending, especially on public sector wages. It's not really an austerity budget, even if it might feel like it. There's a small net stimulus effect, but pretty marginal. Also, although the government will undoubtedly miss its target on building 370,000 homes a year, there are signs that relaxing planning rules may lead to an uptick in construction, and combined with slightly higher levels of public sector investment, more spending on defence, then this will be a positive effect to the economy. Further rises in the minimum wage will also increase incomes for those on low-paid jobs. Also, there is good evidence that one of the really big problems facing the UK is just very high levels of pessimism. Saving in the UK continues to grow to record levels. This is both good news and bad news. It is good news in the sense that many households, although not all, have a greater cushion of savings, which in theory they could spend, and if they did start to spend, that would stimulate investment and higher growth. But also it reflects the very low confidence about the economy, and that is a concern because confidence can remain low for a long time. Look at Japan. Consumers very reluctant to spend, and when consumers hold back from spending, it means that firms will also hold back from investing. Just a quick final point, what could be done to try to improve incomes over the next 5 years? Well, maybe reverse the national insurance hike, end the means testing of winter fuel, upraise housing benefit, and end two-child limit. That would do a lot to increase confidence and spending of average households. To finance it, you could end the triple lock pension guarantee, big problem for the future, costing several billion a year, and it will only continue to grow. Also, maybe a greater adventurousness on tax, maybe something like imposing a tax on bank profits from quantitative easing is a small way to gain a few billion. There's lots of other potential taxes as well. I would also want the Bank of England to halt its policy of reversing quantitative easing. It's really not appropriate at this particular point with rising bond yields and very weak demand. We don't need even higher bond yields at the moment. They've already reversed 300 billion. There's no need to sell another 100 billion on top of all the stress of borrowing at the moment. Now, there is one aspect of the UK economy which seems to always defy the doom and gloom, and that's the housing market. Could house prices continue to defy logic and continue rising? This video looks at the case both for and against. What may happen, no one really knows, but hopefully it'll give you a few ideas. Anyway, thanks for watching, do subscribe and see you soon.